Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
I'm Stephen Carroll, and this is Here's Why, where we take one news story and explain it in just a few minutes with our experts here at Bloomberg. In the global economy, the dollar is king.
We said that the king dollar is back. King dollar is back for European currencies, right? So now that European currencies, the European central banks are more or less done with rate hikes, we think that it's time for the markets to think about rate cuts for these currencies, which will undermine them.
I still think it is king dollar. I mean, right now, the bottom line is we're high already relative to these other currencies and going higher. So I don't see the big drag on the dollar. Let's put it that way.
The US dollar is the closest thing there is to a global currency. It's the most commonly used unit in international transactions, the main reserve for central banks around the world, and it's a safe haven in troubled times. But there is a gradual move away from the greenback happening in some parts of the world, and it's slowly gaining traction.
People have to understand, people in policy have to understand that position the dollar enjoys, there's no entitlement to that. It's not like a guarantee, and you don't want to test people's confidence in that.
Here's why the dollar's dominance is in question. Our senior Washington correspondent, Saleha Mosen, who's written a book on this subject, joins me now for more. Hey Saleha, great to have you with us. Has the dollar always been such a key part of the global economy?
Not forever. It's been a key part of the economy since about 1944. So as the Second World War ended, 44 nations came together and they decided we can't let these wars happen again. And if our economies are deeply connected, it'll be that much harder for us to go to war with each other. So the dollar became the anchor to that. That was the Bretton Woods meeting in 1944. And since then, the dollar and the U.S. has been on a journey gaining the clout that it has now and then testing the power that it's got.
So fast forward to 2024, who's trying to move away from the dollar now and what sort of success are they having?
It's a China-led coalition known as the BRICS Plus, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and a lot of other countries from the Gulf states and others are starting to join the BRICS group. They have a very clear objective that we want to de-dollarize. The brass tacks, though, are that no country has actually abandoned the dollar right now. There's a lot of rhetoric, not as much talk, but still, this is something worth paying attention to because the pipelines in the global financial plumbing system, those pipes to work around the dollar are being created, and that is pretty key to be watching.
So what are the alternatives then that these countries are looking at to replace the dollar in its global role?
The most obvious two that come up are China and the euro. Both of them are missing key attributes to become the leader and replace the dollar. The euro does not have the depth of debt instruments. China does not have the transparency. And I do have to mention, people love to talk about Bitcoin or crypto, but unless something is backed by the government, investors are not going to give it the reserve asset status.
Okay, so those are some of the other options. This is an issue, though, de-dollarization, that's come up in the US presidential election campaign. Does the United States need to worry about the dollar falling out of favour?
It does. The dollar and its status gives the U.S. so much power that complacency is not a good thing. Our low interest rates on our debt, whether we are financing debt to finance public spending or just credit card debt and mortgage loans, all of that debt is way lower than it actually would be in a country with our fiscal profile because we are the owner of the world's reserve asset, and it gives us economic and geopolitical prowess. So we have to be judicious in how it's weaponized and always be protective. The U.S. also seems worried. Treasury officials and even Fed officials have gone into a defensive posture when talking about the dollar. And we hear former President Donald Trump talking about it more and more. And that's because we stand to lose a lot if the dollar loses its power overseas.
Okay, so there's a potential risk there, but the process, it sounds like, is still quite a long way from having any meaningful effect. What could change that? What could speed it up?
Yeah, right now, like I said earlier, no country has actually abandoned the dollar. But for the first time in many, many decades, the conversation is happening. There's papers flying. There's summits around the world happening around, should we move away from the dollar? How do we do it? And I've always said that while people think that anything happening overseas outside of the US could move the de-dollarization bid faster, like China creating a new currency, a joint currency for the BRICS nations or something like that, I actually think that the process would be sped up by something that happens internally in the US. It's volatility in US policymaking and the pillars of our democracy that could actually put a real dent in the dollar. The dollar is the world's reserve asset because investors see that the US is a free and fair democracy. We have independent institutions, a press, free and fair elections, a court system that's fair. If those pillars start to come down and the U.S. cannot be trusted to uphold democracy and predictability, then that is going to slowly start to put more and more chinks in the armor of the dollar.
But this would be something that would need a fairly major event, surely, to change an attitude that's been in place. And as you say, the plumbing of the global financial system that have been in place for so many decades.
Yeah, if you look at history, the last two world's reserve asset, it was the Dutch florin, and after that, it was the British pound. And for both of those, it was a major economic event that triggered the shift away from those currencies being the world's reserve asset. So that pattern tells us that it would take a major event to start that cascade.
Now, you spent a lot of time researching the dollar for your book, Paper Soldiers. Are there any fun facts about the dollar that we might not know about already?
I covered the Treasury Department for 6 years before I wrote that book. And one thing I learned was that reporters will ask a Treasury Secretary about the dollar, what their view of it is at any given point. My favorite two moments are one, when one secretary was in a high school gym in Ohio. This was, I believe it was John Snow. He was in a high school gym in Ohio taking questions, and a high school student asked him, and he looked over to his reporters and said, "You put this high school student up to this?" And another Treasury Secretary was buying Build-A-Bears for his grandchildren. And while he's holding these two boxes, those little houses with bears in them, someone lobbed a dollar question at him.
I love it. We should need to find that high school student now and see how they ended up doing. A fascinating story. Thanks so much for joining us. Our senior Washington correspondent, Saleha Mosen, joining us there. And if you'd like to read Saleha's book on the subject, it's called Paper Soldiers, How the Weaponization of the Dollar Changed the World Order. For more explanations like this from our team of 2,700 journalists and analysts around the world, search for Quick Take on the Bloomberg website or Bloomberg Business app. I'm Stephen Carroll. This is Here's Why. I'll be back next week with more. Thanks for listening.